Okay, the last chapter that we're going to cover in for exam 1 is chapter 23, and this is Broad Patterns of Evolution. It's a relatively short chapter. We're only going to go over sections 1 and 4. A lot of concepts, though, to understand, but it will be one of the smaller portions included in the exam. So we know that when we look at organisms that aren't on Earth today, they're very different than those that are on Earth today. Dinosaurs are very different from the reptiles that we see. And the reason why we're able to know, we grow up and we just know that that's a fact. Well, at some point in time, we had to determine that that was a fact, right? And so we determined that by looking at the fossil record. And fossil records give us evidence of macroevolution. They allow us to decipher things that none of us were alive to know about. And remember that macroevolution is looking at huge, broad changes above the species level. Microevolution is looking at it at the species level, right? But macroevolution would be like the emergence of terrestrial vertebrates from aquatic environments. At one point, everything was in the water, and that process of moving now to land, or impacts of mass extinctions, where huge numbers of species went extinct for whatever reason, or the origin of flight in birds. So at some point, birds did not fly. Their oldest ancestors also lived in the ground, so they had to become terrestrial and then evolve the ability to fly. So the fossil record reveals changes in history of life on Earth. Otherwise, we would never know what happened before we came along. This is an example of just a map kind of showing you how things have changed throughout time. And where we go to get our fossils is really looking at sedimentary rocks. So sedimentary rocks are deposited into layers. These layers stack on top of one another, and they're called strata. And that's the richest source of fossils that we have. So fossil records tell us that there have been great changes in the kind of organisms on Earth at different points in time. These are things that we take as a fact and is just something that we know. But again, at some point, someone had to look at these fossils and decipher these things from these fossils. So there was a point in time when we didn't realize how different we were from things that have become extinct. What's amazing, though, all the information that we know about what happened before we were around is through fossils, but actually very few individuals have become fossilized, and even fewer have been discovered. You hear all the time about new fossils and new bones being found. And one of the reasons for that is that it's deep down, it's hard to find it, but also the fossil record is really biased, and it's in favor of species that have existed for a really long time, because that would mean there would be more of them that would have died, that were very abundant and widespread, and had hard parts. So a lot of soft-bodied organisms probably existed that we will never actually know did exist. But things that have hard parts, like shells on insects, bones, especially for other animals, those are things that that will become fossilized and that we're able to find later on. And we're able to date those rocks and fossils by using radiometric dating. The relative ages of the fossils can be determined by the sequence in the rock strata. So we know that things that are higher up, closer to the soil, are going to be younger than those that are further down in the ground, right? And the absolute ages of fossils are determined by radiometric dating. So if you remember what an isotope is, right? It's an organism that has the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons. And a parent isotope decays and it produces a daughter isotope. And it does this at a constant rate. And so we can determine what isotope is existing in a fossil. And we know that maybe it takes 1,000,000 years for carbon-13 to become 14. And it took another 1,000,000 years for 12 to become 13. But we're able to determine how long that fossil has been there based on the isotope that it is. And we can use radiocarbon dating for fossils up to 75,000 years old. But there's a lot of fossils that are much older than that. So there's some limitations on that. For older fossils, some isotopes can be used to date volcanic rock layers above and below the fossil, and it can get us down a little bit further. A geological record is a standard timescale dividing the Earth's history into different eons. And there are 4 different eons. These aren't eras, they're different than that. There's the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and Phanerozoic. The Phanerozoic encompasses most of the time that animals that we understand to be animals existed on Earth. And it's divided into 3 eras. So eras are going to be shorter or going to be smaller periods of time, right, than eons are. So there's Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Major boundaries between geological divisions correspond to extinction events in the fossil record. And this is just a map, a table that shows you the different eons. Eons right on this far part. Here are the eras within those eons. And then there's periods, and then the age. You can see how long ago these things existed. So if we're looking at million years ago, Earth originated 4,600 million years ago. And through that time, various organisms started to evolve. And if you look at them, they are what we kind of consider to be a little bit more primitive down in this section versus a little bit more advanced up here. And so here we've got our different periods, right? Cretaceous, Jurassic periods, things like that, with our dinosaurs, and then a little bit more advanced up here, younger things that have been around less time. The oldest known fossils are these things called stromatolites, and these are rocks that are formed by accumulations of sedimentary layers on bacterial mats. So we have some stromatolites that date back 3.5 billion years ago. Prokaryotes, and from this information, we know that prokaryotes were the Earth's sole inhabitants for more than 1.5 billion years. Prokaryotes being things that don't have like a nucleus, usually single-celled organisms, right? So very, very primitive things. Early prokaryotes started to release oxygen into the atmosphere through a process called photosynthesis, which you guys learned last semester. And this increased atmospheric oxygen that began 2.4 billion years ago, and because oxygen increased, it led to the extinction of many different organisms. The eukaryotes flourished in the oxygen-rich atmosphere and started to give rise to multicellular organisms. So prokaryotes starting to do photosynthesis gave rise to increased atmospheric oxygen, which was beneficial to eukaryotes, and then that was the start of things like us. Mammals belong to a group of animals called tetrapods. Tetra meaning 4, pod meaning foot or appendage, right? So we have 4 different appendages. And the evolution of unique mammalian features can be traced through gradual changes over time, over long, long, long periods of time. So here's a bunch of other tetrapods. Even reptiles are considered tetrapods because at one point they had a common ancestor that did have 4 appendages. So if we look at the fossil records of the skulls of some of these organisms, going over here, the synapsids, and then they break off into the therapsids and cynodonts. So synapsids had these single pointed teeth, right? All the teeth are kind of all the same, about the same length. They had a large little hole here called a temporal fenestra. They had a hinged jaw, so we can deduce by their teeth and by the fact that they have a hinged jaw that they probably were predaceous, right? They were eating meat. These teeth aren't really meant for consuming plants or anything like that. And then, so that was 300 million years ago, and then they gave rise to the therapsids, 2 280 million years ago. And a little bit different between these guys was they started to have large dentary bones. And we start to see that they now have canines. They still have this big hole, even bigger a little bit, and they still have the hinge. But if you notice that the quadrate bone, the dentary bone, even the squamosal zone, all these things are shaped a little bit differently. And so now we can assume that these guys, at some point, some of these started having bigger and bigger and bigger teeth, giving rise to a new group of species of animals that were able to rip into muscle. And maybe it was co-evolution. Maybe they evolved alongside of other prey that started to gain stronger muscles or something that required to being ripped into a little bit more. Then let's go back up. Look at this one. There's the cynodonts. Then you start looking at cynodonts. So early cynodonts had real large dentary bones. They had large temporal fenestra in front of a hinged jaw and the teeth with several cusps. So they're starting to get kind of like molars back here for chewing a little bit better. The later cynodonts start having teeth with much more of a complex cusp pattern, so much more of a molar, and an additional jaw hinge between. They have an extra jaw hinge now, so better at chewing things. And then our very late cynodonts start to lose that hole that these guys have, and they start. We believe that it starts forming the inner ear bones that function in transmitting sound. So now these guys can hear. We don't think that the species before that were able to hear things. So evolution is like tinkering. It's a process in which new forms arrive by slight modification of existing forms. Sometimes things don't work out, right? And the point is that it's not goal oriented. Nature doesn't say, I want these animals to look a certain way. If you look back at, all these changes that occurred throughout time, it took a lot of different species to determine and to become what we see in mammals today, especially predatory mammals. Most novel biological structures evolve in many stages from previously existing structures. So if you remember back to looking at the head, it took a long time, a lot of things changing, small changes over time in different species before we started getting the inner ear. Same thing, complex eye probably evolved from simple photosensitive cells independently many times. So if we look at squids, this is a big picture of a squid's eye down at the bottom right. Probably started out with just a patch of pigmented cells that could receive light and tell that it was dark versus light, shadows, that kind of thing. Started to evolve and change and gets a little eye cup here. So now we've got more cells. And then maybe the pigmented cells start to close up and almost make a circle. And eventually the cornea, the lens, the retina, and everything else that we need for an eye starts to develop as a result of just, it being beneficial to have these little photoreceptors that are able to see the difference between shadows and light. Exaptations are structures that evolve in one context but become co-adapted for a different function. So they evolve for one reason, but then they become co-opted for a different function. The concept of exaptation does not imply that structures evolve in anticipation of future use. Natural selection can only improve a structure in the context of its current utility. So remember, natural selection is kind of a process of evolution. It can enhance things, and we see natural selection within, you can see it within populations, but even maybe within generations, right? Extracting a single evolutionary progression from the fossil record can also be misleading. And so apparent trends must consider all fossils, even those belonging to extinct linkages. So you can't just take one example from one fossil record and come up with a theory that tells you where this animal lived, what it ate, where it came from. Instead, we look at multiple fossil records of its previous ancestors and even those that are maybe